Kalen moved silently through the dense forest, his weathered boots barely making a sound on the moss-covered ground. Years of solitude had taught him to blend with the wilderness, to become as much a part of it as the ancient trees that towered overhead. The morning mist clung to his leather garments as he checked the small traps he had set the previous evening. Life on the fringes of the known world suited him. 7 years had passed since his exile from the Aravine tribe, punishment for questioning the High Elder's judgment during a time of famine. The memories still stung, but Kalen had long ago accepted his fate. The wilderness had become his home, and solitude his constant companion. His practiced eyes scanned the forest floor, noting the subtle changes in the undergrowth. A bent fern here, disturbed soil there, signs that told stories most would never comprehend. The forest spoke to those who knew how to listen, and it had kept Kalen alive when so many others would have perished. The distant roar of the Black Mist Falls echoed through the valley, a constant reminder of the natural boundary that separated his territory from the volcanic highlands. Few dared to venture that far from the tribe's settlement, with legends of shadow beasts and vengeful spirits keeping most at bay. Such tales amused Kalen. He had faced real dangers in these woods, predators of flesh and blood that required no embellishment to be terrifying. As he approached the base of the falls, something unusual caught his attention. A strange, faint glow emanated from a narrow crevice in the rock face. A peculiar bluish light that pulsed gently, unlike anything natural to the forest. Curiosity piqued, Kalen approached cautiously, one hand resting on the bone-handled knife at his belt. The crevice was barely wide enough for him to squeeze through, requiring him to turn sideways and inch forward into darkness broken only by that mysterious glow. The air grew warmer, heavy with unfamiliar scents, something mineral and sharp, almost metallic. After several claustrophobic moments, the narrow passage opened into a small cavern, its walls glistening with crystal formations that reflected and amplified the source of the light. At the center of the chamber lay a translucent object roughly the size of Kalen's fist. It resembled an egg, though unlike any he had ever seen. The shell, if it could be called that, seemed to shift between solid and liquid states, its surface rippling with iridescent patterns that cast dancing shadows across the cavern walls. Kalen crouched beside it, mesmerized. Something moved within the egg, a small silhouette pressing against its semi-transparent casing. As he watched, a tiny appendage, claw-like but oddly delicate, pushed through the membrane, followed by what appeared to be a narrow, serpentine head. The creature's eyes opened, revealing vertical pupils surrounded by irises of molten gold that fixed upon Kalen with an unsettling intelligence. "What are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the creature. The egg's membrane dissolved completely, leaving a small, damp being no longer than Kalen's forearm. Its body was sleek and reptilian, covered in scales that shifted from midnight blue to deep purple, depending on how the light struck them. 6 limbs, 4 legs ending in delicate claws, and 2 smaller appendages near its shoulders, moved experimentally as the creature took its first breaths. When it attempted to stand, it wobbled and collapsed, emitting a sound somewhere between a chirp and a growl. Despite its obvious weakness, Kalen noted the creature's predatory features. The sharp claws, a row of tiny but pointed teeth visible when it opened its mouth, the alert and calculating gaze that seemed far too aware for a newborn. Common sense told him to leave it, or perhaps end its life quickly. Unknown creatures often brought unknown dangers. Yet something about its vulnerable state stirred something long dormant within him, compassion, perhaps, or simple curiosity about what this strange being might become. "You won't survive out here alone," Kalen said, slowly extending his hand. The creature recoiled initially, then cautiously stretched its neck to sniff his fingers. After a moment's consideration, it climbed onto his palm, its small claws pricking his skin slightly. "I must be losing my mind," Kalen muttered, carefully placing the creature inside his leather pouch. "But I suppose we outcasts should stick together." He named it Nyx, after the ancient word for night in the forgotten language of his ancestors, a fitting name for a creature born in darkness with scales like the midnight sky. The first weeks with Nyx proved challenging. The creature rejected most foods Kalen offered until he discovered it would eagerly consume raw meat, particularly the organs of freshly killed prey. Its appetite was voracious, seemingly disproportionate to its small size. Most alarming was its rate of growth. Within a month, Nyx had quadrupled in size, now resembling a small wildcat, though with distinctly non-feline features. The extra limbs that had initially appeared vestigial had developed into specialized appendages. Not quite wings, not quite arms, but something uniquely functional that Nyx used to climb and manipulate objects with surprising dexterity. By the second month, primitive vocalizations had evolved into a complex system of chirps, purrs, and resonant growls that Kalen began to interpret with increasing accuracy. More unsettling was the growing sense that Nyx understood him perfectly, not just his tone or gestures, but his actual words. Sometimes Kalen would turn to find Nyx staring at him with those golden eyes, head tilted as if contemplating something far beyond the comprehension of an ordinary animal. One night, as they sat beside the fire outside Kalen's modest shelter, Nyx suddenly tensed, its scales darkening to near invisibility against the night. A low warning rumble vibrated from its throat as it positioned itself between Kalen and the surrounding forest. "What is it?" Kalen whispered, reaching for his bow. Moments later, he heard what had alerted Nyx, voices still distant but approaching. In 5 years, no human had ventured this deep into his territory. Silently, he extinguished the fire and moved with Nyx into the shadows of a nearby cluster of ancient ferns. The hunting party from the Aravine tribe moved through the forest with confidence that bordered on arrogance. 6 warriors, their faces painted with the traditional patterns of those who had proven themselves in combat, carried spears tipped with obsidian. At their center walked a woman whose presence commanded attention even in the darkness. Princess Lyra, daughter of Chief Thorn, had grown from the willful girl of Kalen's memories into a formidable figure. Her dark hair was braided with feathers and small bones that signified her rank, and the ceremonial dagger at her hip marked her not just as royalty, but as a warrior in her own right. Unlike the others, her expression showed not conquest but concern. "We shouldn't be here," one of the warriors murmured. "These woods are cursed. The hunting grounds near the settlement yield less game each season," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "The High Elder believes the spirits punish us for some transgression, but I suspect simpler reasons. We've overhunted our territories." "And what of the shadow that stalks these parts?" another asked. 3 hunters from the western outpost claimed to have seen it. "Larger than a mountain cat," they said, with eyes that glowed like embers. Lyra's expression hardened. "Superstitious nonsense. Fear makes shadows grow larger in men's minds." Beside Kalen, Nyx had grown perfectly still, its body temperature cooling to match the surrounding air, an adaptation Kalen had noted with fascination and some unease. The creature's eyes, usually so vibrant, had dimmed to tiny slits of dull amber, nearly invisible in the darkness. "The council meeting is in 2 days," Lyra continued as the group moved past Kalen's hiding place. "I need evidence, not folklore. If these forests can safely provide game, I can convince my father to establish a new hunting territory rather than wage war against the river tribes for theirs." When they had passed out of earshot, Kalen released a breath he'd been holding. "That was close," he whispered to Nyx, who had already begun to return to its normal coloration. "Let's hope they find enough game elsewhere to satisfy them." But even as he spoke, Kalen sensed a shift in the delicate balance of his isolated existence. The tribe's resources were dwindling. It was only a matter of time before they ventured further into these woodlands. And if they discovered Nyx, he looked at his companion, now the size of a large wolf, though, with a build more reminiscent of ancient predators long extinct. Kalen had no illusions about how the tribe would react to such a creature. They would see only a monster, a threat to be eliminated. "We may need to move deeper into the highlands," he told Nyx, scratching behind the ridge of armored scales that had begun to form along its spine. Nyx responded with a low rumble that Kalen had come to associate with disagreement. You don't think so, do you? Kalen smiled despite his concerns. Perhaps you're right. This is our home. We won't be driven from it without good reason. He couldn't have known then how prophetic those words would prove to be, nor how soon he would be tested. The following morning, Kalen woke to find Nyx missing from its usual sleeping spot near the hearth. This wasn't entirely unusual. As the creature had grown, it had begun to hunt independently, sometimes disappearing for hours before returning with evidence of successful kills, bloodied scales, and the occasional trophy like the antler of a mountain deer. But when midday passed with no sign of Nyx, Kalen felt the first twinges of genuine concern. He set about tracking his companion, following the distinctive prints left by its clawed feet. The trail led toward the river that marked the eastern boundary of his usual territory, and alarmingly, towards the area where he had last seen Lyra's hunting party. An hour into his search, Kalen heard the unmistakable sounds of conflict, shouts of men, the clatter of weapons, and a series of roars that could only belong to Nyx. Breaking into a run, he emerged from the dense forest onto the rocky shore of the river to find a scene of chaos. Nyx, now fully revealed in daylight, was a terrifying spectacle of evolutionary perfection. Its body, nearly 12 feet from snout to tail, moved with fluid grace as it faced off against the tribal hunters. 2 warriors already lay injured on the ground, while 3 others formed a protective semicircle around Princess Lyra, who stood with remarkable composure, her ceremonial dagger drawn. Nyx, stop! Kalen shouted, running toward the standoff. All eyes turned to him. The surprised faces of the tribal warriors, Lyra's expression of shock and recognition, and Nyx's golden gaze, pupils contracted to thin slits in the bright light. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Kalen, Lyra said, breaking the silence. You live. It wasn't a question, but something in her tone suggested she had not known with certainty. I do, he replied simply, moving to Nyx's side and placing a calming hand on the creature's shoulder. Under his touch, the raised scales that had flared in aggression slowly flattened. And I would appreciate it if your hunters would lower their weapons. This thing attacked us without provocation. One of the warriors protested, the tip of his spear still pointed at Nyx. I doubt that very much, Kalen responded coolly. Nyx doesn't attack unless threatened. Nyx, Lyra's expression shifted from wariness to curiosity. You've named this creature? It's yours. Not mine, Kalen corrected. We are companions, and you're trespassing in our territory. A bark of laughter escaped one of the warriors. Exiles have no territory. These lands belong to the Aravine tribe by ancestral right. Enough, Darik, Lyra commanded, her eyes never leaving Kalen. With deliberate slowness, she sheathed her dagger, a gesture of temporary truce. Your companion injured 2 of my men. They require treatment. Kalen assessed the wounded warriors. One clutched a deep gash in his thigh that bled freely. The other appeared to have a dislocated shoulder and claw marks across his chest. Serious injuries, but not life-threatening if treated properly. I have supplies in my shelter, he offered reluctantly. It's not far. The decision to help went against Kalen's instincts for self-preservation. But leaving injured men, even those who would likely consider him an enemy, went against something deeper, the core principles that had once made him a respected healer among the Aravine before his exile. The journey back to his shelter was tense, with Nyx pacing restlessly alongside the group, scales shifting between colors as its agitation fluctuated. Kalen kept one hand on the creature whenever possible, a physical reminder of the bond between them and a silent command for restraint. At the shelter, a sturdy structure built against the side of a small cliff, reinforced over years with stone, timber, and ingenious use of natural formations. Kalen set about treating the injured men, while Lyra observed with unconcealed interest. You've made quite a life for yourself out here, she commented, examining the organized collection of dried herbs, the carefully crafted furniture, the wall hangings made from treated hides decorated with natural dyes. Necessity is a powerful motivator, Kalen replied as he applied a poultice of crushed herbs to the warrior's leg wound, as is having ample time to perfect one's skills. And this creature, Lyra glanced to where Nyx had positioned itself near the entrance, golden eyes tracking every movement. Where did it come from? Kalen considered how much to reveal. I found it as a hatchling, near the volcanic highlands. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Nor has anyone else, I'd wager. Lyra moved slightly closer to Nyx, studying its features with scientific interest rather than fear. It's magnificent, dangerous, clearly but magnificent. Nyx's head tilted at her words, and Kalen didn't miss the flicker of surprise that crossed Lyra's face at this very human-like response. It understands speech, she stated rather than asked. More than you might think, Kalen confirmed, finishing his work on the first warrior and moving to the second. Nyx is highly intelligent. Before Lyra could inquire further, a distant sound caught everyone's attention, an eerie, reverberating howl unlike anything native to the forest. Nyx immediately stood, its scales darkening and a ridge along its spine rising defensively. What was that? One of the uninjured warriors asked, gripping his spear tighter. Kalen shook his head. I don't know. That's not a sound I've heard before. We should return to the settlement, Dark insisted, looking to Lyra. Princess, whatever made that sound, isn't something I want to encounter with two injured men to protect, Lyra finished firmly. But nightfall approaches. Traveling through these woods in darkness would be foolish. The implication hung in the air. They would need to remain at Kalen's shelter until morning, an arrangement that pleased no one. You may stay, Kalen said eventually. But understand this. Any threat to Nyx will be considered a threat to me. We've harmed no one who hasn't first sought to harm us. Lyra held his gaze, an unspoken assessment passing between them. Agreed, she said finally. No harm will come to either of you from my people, provided the same courtesy is extended to us. As darkness fell, the strange howling grew more frequent, seemingly closer with each occurrence. The tribal warriors huddled near the fire, speaking in low voices while casting nervous glances toward the forest. Lyra, however, sat apart, her attention divided between the ancient book she had carried in her pack and observations of Kalen and Nyx. The records speak of creatures that might match Nyx's description, she said eventually, beckoning Kalen to join her. Though the accounts are fragmented, more legend than history. She turned the book towards him, revealing illustrations of serpentine beings with multiple limbs and armored scales. The ancient text was written in a script few could still read, but Kalen recognized enough to understand the significance. The Guardians of the Veil, he translated slowly. I thought those were just stories told to frighten children. All stories have some seed of truth, Lyra replied. According to this, they were sentinels created before the Great Sundering to protect the balance between worlds. Most were destroyed during the Cataclysm, but some eggs were said to have been hidden, preserved in stasis until awakened by compatible souls. The implication of her words settled over Kalen like a weight. You believe Nyx is one of these guardians? I believe, Lyra said carefully, that Nyx is something extraordinary, and perhaps, given recent events, its appearance is not coincidental. What recent events? Lyra closed the book, her expression grave. The western outposts have been abandoned, not due to superstition, as I led my men to believe, but because of attacks. Entire settlements decimated overnight, with few survivors to tell what happened. Those who lived described creatures that moved like shadows, larger than bears but silent as death, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The description sent a chill through Kalen that had nothing to do with the night air. And you think these attacks and Nyx's appearance are connected? I don't know, Lyra admitted, but the timing seems significant. The first attack came exactly one full moon after the starfall in the volcanic highlands, the night when, if I understand your timeline correctly, you would have found Nyx's egg. The conversation was interrupted by another howl, much closer now, followed by several answering calls from different directions. Nyx sprang to its feet, a deep growl rumbling in its chest as it positioned itself between the shelter entrance and the others. "They're surrounding us," Dark whispered, fear evident in his voice despite his warrior status. Kalen moved to Nyx's side, placing a steadying hand on the creature's flank. "Whatever they are, they're hunting," he said softly, "and we're their prey." The night erupted into chaos with little warning. Dark shapes, moving with unnatural speed, burst from the forest edge. In the flickering firelight, Kalen caught only impressions: bodies larger than wolves, but more sinuous, with elongated limbs that ended in curved talons, and faces that seemed almost to shift between forms, never quite settling into anything recognizable except for the glowing red eyes. Nyx met the first attacker mid-leap, the two creatures colliding with such force that the ground beneath them shook. The tribal warriors formed a defensive circle around their injured comrades, while Lyra took up position beside Kalen, her dagger joined by a longer blade she had concealed in her pack. "We can't fight them all," she shouted over the sounds of combat as more shadow creatures emerged from the darkness. Kalen knew she was right. For every creature they managed to drive back or wound, two more seemed to take its place. Nyx fought with savage efficiency, its scales now glowing with an inner blue light that seemed to repel the shadow beings. But even Nyx couldn't be everywhere at once. "The caverns," Kalen decided, pointing to the narrow passage at the back of his shelter that led into the cliff face. "There's a network of tunnels that might lose them." "Might?" Lyra questioned, though she was already moving to help the injured man. "It's our only chance," Kalen insisted. "Nyx and I will cover your retreat." For a moment, it seemed Lyra might argue, but a fresh wave of attackers forced the decision. She nodded sharply, directing her warriors to help their wounded comrades into the passage. Kalen turned to Nyx, who was holding three shadow creatures at bay with sweeping strikes of its powerful tail. "Nyx," to me, the connection between them, that inexplicable bond that had formed from the moment the creature had hatched, manifested in Nyx's immediate response. The predator disengaged from combat with one final, vicious slash that sent its opponents retreating momentarily, then rushed to Kalen's side. Together, they backed toward the tunnel entrance, Kalen wielding a torch in one hand and his knife in the other. While Nyx's scales brightened to an almost painful intensity, the blue glow seeming to cause physical discomfort to the shadow creatures. "Go!" Kalen shouted to Lyra, who stood ready at the tunnel entrance. "We're right behind you." The narrow passage forced them into single file, Lyra leading, followed by her warriors supporting the injured, with Kalen and Nyx bringing up the rear. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, growing increasingly frantic and enraged as the shadow creatures realized their prey was escaping. The tunnel system was complex, a natural labyrinth of limestone carved over millennia by underground water flows. Kalen had explored some sections during his years of exile, but never mapped the entire network. Now, guided more by instinct than knowledge, he directed the group through junction after junction, ascending gradually toward what he hoped would lead to an exit on higher ground. "Do you actually know where we're going?" Dark demanded after nearly an hour of difficult progress, the wounded men showing signs of exhaustion. "Away from those things," Kalen replied tersely, "which should be our primary concern." Lyra intervened before the tension could escalate. "The sounds of pursuit have faded. We should rest briefly, tend to the wounded." Reluctantly, Kalen agreed. They had reached a larger chamber where several tunnels converged, with a small underground spring providing fresh water. While Lyra and her men established a temporary camp, Kalen knelt beside Nyx, examining the creature for injuries. Despite numerous encounters with the shadow beings, Nyx appeared remarkably unharmed. The few wounds visible were already closing, the scales knitting together before Kalen's eyes. More concerning was the way Nyx stared fixedly down one of the unexplored tunnels, a low, continuous growl vibrating from deep within its chest. "What is it?" Kalen whispered. "Do you sense something?" Nyx's response was unexpected. The creature nudged Kalen toward the tunnel, then took several steps in that direction before looking back expectantly. "I think it wants us to follow," Lyra observed, having approached silently. "It seems purposeful." Kalen hesitated. The bond with Nyx had never led him astray, but the responsibility of the entire group weighed heavily. "Those creatures could still be hunting us." "True," Lyra acknowledged. "But your companion seems to think whatever lies down that tunnel is important, perhaps even crucial to our survival." The decision wasn't easy, but the determined look in Nyx's golden eyes convinced Kalen. "We'll follow, but cautiously. Your injured men can remain here with one guard if they're too weak to continue." Lyra shook her head. "We stay together. Those who can't walk will be carried." The tunnel Nyx led them through descended steeply, the air growing warmer and tinged with that same mineral, almost metallic scent Kalen remembered from the cavern where he had found Nyx's egg. The walls gradually changed from natural limestone to something else, smooth surfaces embedded with geometric patterns that glowed faintly when touched, clearly artificial despite their ancient appearance. "What is this place?" one of the warriors whispered, momentarily replacing fear. No one answered, for none had an explanation that seemed adequate. Even the tribe's oldest legends made no mention of such structures beneath the mountains. After what seemed like hours, but might have been much less, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber that defied comprehension. The ceiling arched hundreds of feet overhead, supported by columns carved with symbols similar to those in Lyra's ancient book. At the center stood a raised dais, upon which rested a crystalline structure that pulsed with the same blue light that emanated from Nyx's scales when the creature was agitated. "This can't be natural," Dark murmured. "Who built this?" "When?" "Before," Lyra said softly, her fingers tracing the symbols on a nearby column. "Before the Great Sundering. Before the tribes. Perhaps before humanity as we understand it." Nyx moved purposefully toward the central dais, its scales now glowing in perfect rhythm with the crystal structure. When the creature reached the platform, it turned to Kalen, eyes conveying an unmistakable message. "It wants me to approach," Kalen realized aloud. "Are you sure that's wise?" Lyra asked, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than warning. Kalen managed a tense smile. "Wisdom hasn't exactly been my guiding principle since I found Nyx." "Why start now?" As he stepped onto the dais, the crystal structure's pulsing intensified. When he placed his hand on it, compelled by an instinct he couldn't explain, images flooded his mind with such force that he staggered. Visions of ancient battles between light and shadow. Glimpses of beings like Nyx, but fully grown and infinitely more powerful, standing as sentinels against encroaching darkness. The creation of the eggs, infused with the last essence of dying guardians, hidden away until worthy companions could awaken them. And most alarmingly, he saw the source of the shadow creatures. A rift, a tear in the fabric between worlds, gradually widening as the ancient seals that had contained it failed after millennia of neglect. When the vision released him, Kalen found himself on his knees, Lyra's steadying hand on his shoulder and concern in her eyes. "What did you see?" she asked. "The end," he replied hoarsely. "Or the beginning of it. Those creatures, they're just the first wave. The rift is growing larger with each passing day. Soon, nothing will stop what comes through. Nothing except the guardians," Lyra concluded, looking at Nyx with new understanding. "That's why it brought us here. It knows its purpose, even if it's not yet grown into its full power." "But Nyx is alone," Kalen objected. "One guardian against what I saw. It wouldn't be enough." A strange expression crossed Lyra's face. "Perhaps not alone." She opened her pack and carefully withdrew a small object wrapped in protective layers of soft hide. When she uncovered it, Kalen's breath caught. In her hands lay an egg, nearly identical to the one from which Nyx had hatched, though its surface shimmered with green rather than blue iridescence. "Found in the sacred caves beneath the tribal temple," Lyra explained. "It's been in the royal family's keeping for generations, though none knew what it contained. It was simply the sacred relic, to be protected at all costs." She glanced at Nyx. "Until 3 nights ago, when it began to pulse with light. The implications were staggering. "There are more eggs," Kalen said. "There must be. Scattered, hidden," Lyra agreed. "Protected until needed. But finding them all would take time we may not have." Nyx approached the egg in Lyra's hands, gently touching it with one foreclaw. The eggs pulsing synchronized immediately with Nyx's own bioluminescence, confirmation of their shared origin and purpose. "You need to choose a companion for it," Kalen realized, looking at Lyra, "as I did for Nyx, though I didn't understand what I was doing." Lyra met his gaze steadily. "I already have. The egg responded to my touch alone among all who tried. That's the real reason I led this expedition, to find answers about what that means." A distant rumble shook the cavern, dust drifting down from the ancient ceiling. The shadow creatures hadn't given up their hunt. They were burrowing, digging their way toward the chamber. "We need to return to the tribe," Lyra decided. "With what we know now, we can begin preparations. The elders must be convinced of the threat. They'll never believe without proof," Dark argued. "And they certainly won't accept them." He gestured to Nyx. "Then we'll provide proof they cannot ignore," Lyra said with the authority of one born to command. She turned to Kalen. "I came here seeking a new hunting ground. Instead, I found an exiled tribesman who might hold the key to our survival. Will you return with us?" The question struck Kalen to his core. Return to the people who had cast him out? Face the judgment of those who had deemed him unworthy of their society? Yet as Nyx pressed against his side, golden eyes reflecting the ancient light of the chamber, Kalen recognized that his path had changed irrevocably the moment he had discovered that strange, glowing egg. "I will," he answered finally. "Not for them. For this." He gestured to encompass Nyx, the egg in Lyra's hands, the ancient chamber with its warnings from a forgotten age. "For what's coming." Lyra nodded, understanding the significance of his decision. "Then we should find another way out. One that leads toward tribal lands." As if in response to her words, Nyx moved to another tunnel entrance, one they hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a fallen column. The creature looked back expectantly, its intention clear. "It seems your companion agrees," Lyra observed with a hint of a smile. "Nyx usually knows what it's doing," Kalen replied, gathering his remaining supplies. "Even when I don't." The journey through this new tunnel was arduous but uncontested by shadow creatures. It led steadily upward, eventually emerging onto a mountain ledge overlooking a vast expanse of forest. In the distance, barely visible through morning mist, lay the smoke of cooking fires from the Aravine settlement. 2 days' travel, Lyra estimated, orienting herself. If we push hard and encounter no resistance. Kalen stared at the distant settlement, memories of his former life mingling with apprehension about what awaited him there. "And what happens when we arrive? How do you propose to explain me? Or Nyx?" "Honestly," Lyra replied simply, "the time for hidden truths has passed. The threat we face will consume us all if we don't stand against it together." The descent from the mountain was treacherous but uneventful. By nightfall, they had reached the foothills, establishing camp in a defensive position with clear sight lines in all directions. Nyx patrolled the perimeter restlessly, its senses far keener than any human's. While her warriors tended the fire and the wounded, Lyra sat beside Kalen, the egg cradled carefully in her lap. "The tribal legends speak of the great exile. Not you," she clarified with a small smile, "but an ancient event when those who had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge were cast out of paradise." "I'm familiar with the story," Kalen acknowledged. "It's told to warn children against curiosity and questioning authority. Lessons I clearly failed to absorb." "Perhaps," Lyra said thoughtfully, "it was never meant as a warning, but as preparation. The forbidden knowledge might have been understanding of the rift, of the darkness that waits beyond. The paradise lost wasn't physical, but the innocence of ignorance." Kalen considered this interpretation. A comfortable theory, but one unlikely to convince the elders to welcome back an exile accompanied by a creature from their nightmares. "You underestimate the power of fear," Lyra observed. The shadow attacks have already reached the settlement's outer farms. 3 families slaughtered last full moon. The elders seek answers, solutions, even if they come from unexpected sources. Before Kalen could respond, Nyx froze in its patrol, head raised and senses alert. A moment later, the creature raced back to Kalen's side, communicating urgency through posture and a series of short, sharp vocalizations. "Something's coming," Kalen translated, leaping to his feet. "Everyone, prepare." The warning came barely in time. From the darkened forest emerged not the shadow creatures they had faced before, but something far worse, a towering entity that seemed composed of living darkness, its form constantly shifting and reforming, multiple limbs extending and retracting as it moved. Where the smaller creatures had glowing red eyes, this being possessed countless orbs of crimson light scattered throughout its amorphous body. "Ancestors, preserve us," one of the warriors whispered, his spear trembling in his grip. Nyx positioned itself between the group and the approaching horror, scales blazing with blue light. The creature had grown impressively during their journey through the tunnels, but still appeared drastically outmatched by this new threat. To everyone's shock, Lyra stepped forward to stand beside Nyx, the egg in her hands now pulsing with intense green light that seemed to cause the darkness entity physical distress. Where the combined illumination touched it, the being's substance hissed and recoiled like water on hot stone. "Light hurts it," Lyra called over her shoulder. "Build up the fire. Torches, anything that burns." The warriors rushed to obey, but Kalen knew it wouldn't be enough. This entity was clearly stronger than the smaller shadow creatures, perhaps even a commander of sorts. Conventional weapons would be useless against its non-corporeal form. "Lyra," he said urgently, "the egg. It's responding to your emotions, your determination. Focus on that connection, the same bond one shared with Nyx." Understanding flickered across her face. Clutching the egg tightly, Lyra closed her eyes, her expression shifting from fear to intense concentration. The egg's pulsing grew stronger, more regular, until suddenly its surface began to crack, spiderwebbing with fine lines that leaked brilliant green light. The shadow entity sensed the imminent threat, gathering itself for an attack. Nyx lunged forward to intercept, meeting the darkness in a collision of opposing forces that sent shockwaves through the clearing. Kalen felt the battle more than he saw it, his connection with Nyx transmitting echoes of pain, determination, and primal rage. Meanwhile, the egg in Lyra's hands had split completely open, revealing a creature similar to Nyx in its earliest form, though with scales that shifted between emerald and turquoise. Unlike Nyx's birth, however, this hatchling emerged fully alert, its eyes fixed on the battle raging before it. Without hesitation, the newborn guardian leapt from Lyra's hands, its tiny body elongating mid-air, as if aging years in seconds. By the time it reached the shadow entity, the creature had grown to the size of a large dog, its scales radiating green light that complemented Nyx's blue. The combined assault forced the shadow entity to retreat, its substance dissipating into smaller components that fled into the darkness. Nyx and the new guardian, whom Lyra would later name Vex, stood side by side, their complementary lights creating a protective barrier around the camp. "That was not a victory," Kalen said quietly as he examined Nyx for injuries. "Merely a respite." "Agreed," Lyra replied, reaching out tentatively to the new guardian, which approached her with the same trust Nyx had shown Kalen in those early days. "But it confirms what we suspected. The guardians, working together, have power against these entities. Each guardian that awakens strengthens our chances. If we find more eggs," Kalen reminded her, "and if they hatch in time." "One challenge at a time," Lyra said with pragmatic authority. "First, we reach the settlement. Then we convince the council of what's coming." The remainder of their journey passed with tense vigilance, but no further encounters with shadow entities. As they approached the settlement's outer boundary, marked by totem poles carved with the tribe's sacred animals, Kalen's apprehension grew. Beside him, Nyx sensed his discomfort, pressing closer as if offering reassurance. Stay close to me, Lyra instructed as they reached the first outlying structures. Let me speak first. The settlement had changed little in the years of Kalen's exile. Wooden dwellings arranged in concentric circles around the central council lodge, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing among domestic animals. Activity slowed as people noticed the returning hunting party, first with relief, then confusion, and finally alarm as they spotted Nyx and Vex. Word spread rapidly. By the time they reached the central plaza, a crowd had gathered, including the tribal elders who emerged from the council lodge with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. High Elder Morok, his face painted with the sacred symbols of authority and his headdress denoting decades of leadership, stepped forward. Princess Lyra, he began formally, then faltered as his gaze moved from her to Kalen and finally to the two guardians. Explain this. Sacrilege. Lyra met his stare directly, her posture conveying both respect for his position and confidence in her own authority. High Elder, council members, people of the Aravine, I return with knowledge vital to our survival, accompanied by those who will be instrumental in the coming conflict. You return with an exile, Morok countered sharply, pointing to Kalen, and abominations unknown to our lore. I return, Lyra corrected firmly, with a man whose exile was based on ignorance, and with guardians prophesied in our most ancient texts. She held up the book she had shown Kalen earlier. The sacred codex speaks of them, of the darkness they were created to fight, the same darkness that now takes our people in the night. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The recent shadow attacks had left the tribe fearful and searching for answers. Superstition and desperation, declared Varric, the tribe's war chief and Lyra's most vocal critic on the council. You've always been too fascinated by the old texts, princess. Now you bring monsters into our midst based on childhood stories. Before Lyra could respond, Vex, still relatively small compared to Nyx, but growing visibly with each passing hour, approached Varric with deliberate steps. The war chief reached for his weapon, but the young guardian made no aggressive move. Instead, it sat before him and began to glow with an intensity that illuminated the entire plaza. Within that light, images formed, not physical, but somehow visible to all present. The same visions Kalen had experienced in the underground chamber played out for the entire tribe to witness. The ancient battle, the creation of the guardian eggs, the growing rift, and the darkness that awaited beyond it. When the visions faded, Vex returned to Lyra's side, leaving stunned silence in its wake. Even Varric stood speechless, his hand fallen away from his weapon. This is no story, Lyra said into the quiet. This is our reality. The shadow creatures attacking our outlying farms are merely scouts, the first wave of what will come if the rift continues to widen. She gestured to Nyx and Vex. The Guardians were created to seal such rifts, to maintain the balance between worlds. But they need our help to locate the remaining eggs and awaken more of their kind. Hi. Elder Morok stroked his ceremonial beard, visibly troubled. Even if what you show us is true, Princess, what would you have us do? We are but one tribe, with limited warriors and resources. Unite the tribes. Kalen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying across the plaza with unexpected authority. The river people, the mountain clans, even the desert nomads. All must be warned, all must join in the search for guardian eggs. And who would listen to us? Varric challenged, recovering his composure. Ancient rivalries are not easily set aside. They will listen, Lyra stated confidently, when they face the same shadow attacks we have endured, when they see what we have seen. She turned to address the entire gathering. The time of isolation has ended. We must reach outward, form alliances thought impossible, prepare for a war unlike any in living memory. A tense debate followed, with opinions divided among both council members and ordinary tribespeople. Some saw the wisdom in Lyra's words. Others feared change, and outsiders more than the shadow threat. As the arguments continued, Nyx suddenly tensed, its scales darkening in warning. Moments later, Vex displayed similar alertness. Both guardians turned toward the northwestern forest edge, growls emanating from deep in their throats. They sensed something, Kalen warned, interrupting the debate. The shadow entities, they're coming. Skepticism transformed to alarm as a terrible howl. The same sound they had heard during their first encounter with the shadow creatures echoed across the settlement. Not one howl, but dozens, a chorus of otherworldly predators coordinating an attack. To arms, Varric shouted, his opposition to Lyra's plan temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Get the children and elders to the central lodge, Lyra commanded. Warriors formed defensive positions. Fire, we need more fire. Every torch, every brazier lit. The tribe mobilized with practiced efficiency, years of training for conventional threats now adapted to this new danger. Kalen found himself directing a group of young warriors, his exile seemingly forgotten as they looked to him for guidance. The light hurts them, he instructed, helping to establish a perimeter of fire pits. But it doesn't kill them. Aim for the eyes, they're the most vulnerable points. Nyx and Vex took up positions at opposite sides of the settlement, their bioluminescence intensifying as darkness fell. Kalen could feel Nyx's anticipation through their bond. Not fear, but a sense of purpose fulfilled. The Guardian had been created for this exact scenario, to protect against this specific threat. The shadow entities struck at twilight, pouring from the forest like a flood of living darkness. Smaller creatures similar to those Kalen had faced before led the charge, followed by several of the larger, amorphous beings. Behind them all came something new. A towering figure twice the height of man, with a more defined form that suggested a terrible parody of humanity, its body composed of swirling darkness shot through with veins of crimson energy. The commander, Lyra breathed, standing beside Kalen on the defensive wall. That's what controls them. The battle erupted with chaotic intensity. Tribal warriors fought bravely, but found their conventional weapons largely ineffective against the shadow entities. Only fire and light seemed to genuinely harm them, forcing the defenders to adapt quickly, using torches as primary weapons and spears only to keep the creatures at bay. Nyx and Vex became the central points of resistance, their light creating safe zones where the shadow entities couldn't penetrate. The Guardians fought with coordinated precision that belied their limited time together, Nyx's greater size and strength complemented by Vex's speed and agility. Yet despite their efforts, the shadow forces were overwhelming. For every entity repelled or destroyed, two more emerged from the darkness. The defensive perimeter began to contract as warriors fell or were forced to retreat. We can't hold them indefinitely, Varric admitted, joining Kalen and Lyra with blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. There are too many. Lyra's expression hardened with determination. Then we don't try to hold them. We strike at the source. She pointed to the commander entity, which remained behind the front lines, directing the assault through some unseen connection. If we can destroy that one, the others might lose cohesion. A direct assault would be suicide, Varric objected. Not an assault, Kalen corrected, understanding Lyra's intention. A focused strike. Nyx and Vex together, combining their power. The plan formed quickly, while the tribal warriors maintained what remained of the defensive line, creating a diversion with intensified fire attacks along the perimeter. Kalen and Lyra would lead Nyx and Vex in a circuitous route to approach the commander entity from behind. You'll be cut off from the settlement, Varric warned. If you fail, then the settlement falls regardless, Lyra replied simply. This is our best chance. Under cover of smoke and shadow, the small group slipped through a narrow gap in the battle lines. Kalen led the way, his years in the wilderness having honed his ability to move unseen. Lyra followed, with Nyx and Vex flanking them protectively, their bioluminescence dimmed to avoid detection. They circled wide through the forest, approaching the shadow forces from the rear. The commander entity stood upon a rocky outcropping, its attention fixed on directing the assault against the settlement. Up close, it appeared even more terrifying, a void in the shape of a being, consuming all light that touched it except for those pulsing veins of malevolent energy. "How do we fight something like that?" Lyra whispered, her earlier confidence wavering slightly at the sight of their enemy. Kalen didn't respond verbally, instead placing one hand on Nyx's flank and the other on Vex. "Focus on our connection," he instructed softly. "The bond between Guardian and Companion amplifies their power." Understanding, Lyra placed both hands on Vex, closing her eyes to concentrate on the link that had formed when the egg hatched. Kalen did the same with Nyx, drawing upon years of shared experience and trust. The response was immediate and dramatic. Both Guardians began to glow with unprecedented intensity, their separate blue and green auras merging where they touched to form a brilliant turquoise light. The Commander entity sensed the threat, turning away from the battle to face this new danger. What followed defied conventional description. The Shadow Commander launched a direct attack, tendrils of darkness extending toward them with lethal intent. Nyx and Vex responded in perfect unison, meeting darkness with light in a collision of opposing forces. The forest around them warped under the strain, trees bending as if in a hurricane, the very air seeming to crack with the release of primal energies. Kalen and Lyra were thrown backward by the shockwave, landing hard against the forest floor. Through dazed eyes, Kalen witnessed Nyx and Vex advance on the Commander entity, their combined light cutting through its darkness like a blade. The entity fought back with desperate intensity, lashing out with constructs of pure shadow that briefly dimmed the Guardian's radiance, but couldn't extinguish it. The final moment came when Nyx and Vex, moving as if guided by ancient instinct, positioned themselves on opposite sides of the Commander. Their light intensified to blinding levels, creating a perfect circle that contracted around the shadow being. Where that light touched the entity, its substance didn't merely retreat, but dissolved completely, returning to whatever dimension had spawned it. With a final, terrible screech that seemed to echo between worlds, the Commander entity collapsed in upon itself, imploding into a singularity of darkness that winked out of existence. Throughout the forest, the lesser shadow creatures faltered, their coordinated assault disintegrating into chaotic individual actions easily repelled by the tribal defenders. Victory had come at a cost. Nyx and Vex lay exhausted, their bioluminescence dimmed to barely visible embers. Kalen rushed to Nyx's side, fearing the worst, but found the Guardian still breathing, its golden eyes meeting his with weary recognition. "They've depleted themselves," he explained to Lyra, who knelt beside Vex with similar concern. "The power they channeled. It was too much for just two of them. But they succeeded," Lyra noted, gently stroking Vex's scaled head. "They drove back the darkness." "For now," Kalen qualified, helping Nyx to stand on wobbly legs. "But the rift remains. More will come through, perhaps even stronger than what we face today. We need to find the other eggs, awaken more Guardians. And we will," Lyra promised, rising to her feet with newfound authority. "After tonight, no one in the tribe will question the threat we face or the path we must take to combat it." She was right. When they returned to the settlement, they found a transformed perspective. Warriors who had been skeptical now regarded the Guardians with reverence. Council members who had opposed alliance with other tribes now argued for immediate diplomatic missions. Even High Elder Morok, traditionally the most conservative voice, acknowledged that ancient ways must sometimes yield to new realities. In the council lodge, as dawn broke after the long night of battle, a new course was charted for the Aravine tribe. Messengers would be dispatched to neighboring tribes, carrying evidence of the shadow threat and proposals for united action. Search parties would be organized to locate more Guardian eggs, guided by the ancient texts and the sensing abilities of Nyx and Vex. Defenses would be strengthened, warriors trained in new techniques effective against shadow entities. And at the center of it all stood Kalen and Lyra, no longer exile and princess, but partners in a cause that transcended tribal politics and personal history. Their bond, like that between human and Guardian, had been forged in crisis and tempered by shared purpose. What happens now? Kalen asked quietly as they stood at the settlement's edge, watching Nyx and Vex recover their strength in the morning sunlight. When more eggs are found, when more guardians awaken, what then? Lyra considered the question seriously. We fight. We seal the rift. We restore the balance that was lost. She turned to face him directly. And then, perhaps, we build something new from what we've learned. A world where exiles and princesses find common ground, where ancient enemies become allies, where the boundaries that once defined us become less important than the bonds that unite us. Nyx approached them, its strength visibly returning with each passing hour. The Guardian had grown again during the battle, now standing taller than a horse, its scales shifting with complex patterns that seemed to reflect its thoughts. It nudged Kalen gently, then turned its golden gaze toward the distant mountains where its journey had begun. It senses something, Kalen translated, their connection allowing him insights into Nyx's awareness. More eggs, perhaps, or another rift forming. Then we'll face it together, Lyra stated simply, as Vex moved to stand beside her. All of us. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating a landscape forever changed by the night's events, 4 figures stood silhouetted against the morning sky, 2 humans who had transcended their separate destinies to forge a common future, and 2 guardians born of ancient power to protect a world worth saving. Behind them, a tribe prepared for challenges beyond anything in their history. Before them lay a journey with no certain end, but with the promise of purpose in every step. The shadow entities would return. The rift would widen. The darkness would surge against the light with ever-increasing desperation. But for this moment, in this dawn, hope prevailed, not the blind optimism of the innocent, but the tempered determination of those who had faced the abyss and chosen to stand against it, regardless of the cost. Kalen placed his hand on Nyx's scaled shoulder, feeling the living warmth beneath, the connection that had changed everything. "Ready?" he asked, the question meant for all 3 of his companions. Lyra nodded, one hand resting on Vex while the other, after a moment's hesitation, found Kalen's. "Ready," she confirmed. Together, they turned toward the horizon and whatever awaited beyond it. Guardians and guardians united in a quest that had only just begun.